Good morning again, everyone. If you've traveled up I-95, you know that eventually you reach the top of Harford County. You're traveling through a wooded area when suddenly it seems like everything drops away from you as you find yourself on an open bridge crossing the Susquehanna River. Know what I'm talking about? For someone like me who's not always fond of heights, when I hit that bridge, I often get this sinking feeling in my stomach as everything drops away from me and I find myself in this huge gap between Harford and Cecil counties. My guess is that most people aren't all that fond of gaps. Whenever we see them, we try to fill them up. If we have a gap in our teeth, we try to correct it. If we see a gap, say, between two mountains or two shores, we try to bridge them. Gaps leave us feeling empty. In today's gospel, Jesus tells us a parable of the rich man and the poor man Lazarus. We'll be looking at Luke chapter 16. The parable begins at verse 19. Now, what's striking about this parable is the gap that Jesus describes between heaven and hell. The poor man Lazarus, who has nothing, dies and is taken to heaven and is at the bosom of Abraham, whereas the rich man, who remains unnamed, who has everything, dies and is in the netherworld. And between them, this gap is described. Jesus has Abraham describing it at verse 26. He says, "Between us and you a great chasm is established to prevent anyone from crossing who might wish to go from our side to yours or from your side to ours." Now, I always find that gap somewhat daunting. It seems to me to emphasize the permanency of the afterlife. The fact that this gap between heaven and hell is permanent and can never be bridged. And yet, in this parable, that is not the only gap that Jesus describes. If we look at how he begins the parable, he starts this way. "There was a rich man who dressed in purple garments and fine linen, and dined sumptuously each day. And lying at his door was a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who would gladly have eaten his fill of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. Dogs even used to come and lick his sores." Jesus describes a gap between the life of the rich man on earth and the life of Lazarus. A gap that is just as real as the gap between heaven and hell. In fact, we might even conceive of the gap between heaven and hell as simply the extension of the gap between Lazarus and the rich man in this life. In this life, there was no relation between the rich man and Lazarus. There was no bridge or bonding between the two. And that gap simply persisted into the next life. Now, notice how Jesus, as he tells this story, does not give us a moral assessment of either man. Lazarus is not described as a faithful, observant man, and the rich man is not described as a thief or a crook. All we know is that the two of them live side by side without any relationship between them. Only the gap. And that gap persists into the next life. Notice how the rich man from across that gap sees Abraham and asks at verse 24, "Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am suffering torment in these flames." Without any relationship with Lazarus, all the rich man can see is how Lazarus could serve his needs, even in the next life. No relationship between the two. And so it's at that point that Abraham highlights the two gaps that are at work. He says to him, "My child, remember that you received what was good during your lifetime, while Lazarus likewise received what was bad. But now he is comforted here, whereas you are tormented. Moreover, between us and you a great chasm is established to prevent anyone from crossing who might wish to go out from our side to yours, or from your side to ours." There's no moral assessment even in why one is in the netherworld and why one is in heaven. All Abraham says is that there has been a reversal of fortune. That the one in this life who experienced the bad, now in the next life experiences the good, and vice versa. But it seems to have nothing to do with their moral character. And for me, that's the most haunting part of the story. Because don't we want to be assured that if we behave morally, we'll be in heaven with Abraham? Yet what if heaven and hell have nothing to do with our morality? What if they have to do with our relationships with one another? You see, there are all kinds of brokenness in our world that we often see unrelated to our lives. Almost every week, we read the names and ages of those who are killed by violence in Baltimore City. It breaks our hearts, and it raises our awareness. But do the deaths of these individuals, mostly teenagers and young adults, do their deaths really change our lives? We walk or drive around the city, and we encounter homeless people asking for money and support. And we might even hand them a few dollars or give them something to eat or drink. But does their homelessness really change our lives? Or we know of family or friends or church members who are struggling in relationships or dealing with troubled relatives. And we may reach out to them and listen to their concerns and even pray for them. But do their struggles really change our lives? The problem with the rich man in the parable wasn't that he was dishonest or a thief or a hoarder or any of that. The problem with the rich man wasn't that he didn't believe in God. In fact, he probably understood his wealth and good fortune as a blessing from God. For all we know, he observed the Sabbath and tithed his income every week. No, the problem with the rich man was that he lived his life in a way that was totally unaffected by the life and situation of Lazarus. He made no effort to see himself as related to Lazarus. And so he allowed his life to continue without being changed by Lazarus. He allowed the gap to persist, and persist it did, right into the next life. The reversal of fortunes of the two men shows, at the very least, that God did not regard the struggles of Lazarus as a curse, nor the wealth of the rich man as a blessing. He's present to both men throughout their lives, and even into eternity. Their fate in eternity, however, reverses not because of anything they do, but because of what God does. Remember, Abraham says to the rich man, you received what was good during your lifetime, while Lazarus likewise received what was bad. But now he is comforted, whereas you are tormented. This is the justice of God at work, and something we should all remember, especially when we're the ones who suffer and struggle in life. God is always with us, and God will right whatever is wrong, one way or another, in this life or in the next. And if we want to be part of God righting what is wrong with this world, then we're going to have to be in relationship with the brokenness in the world. If we're not the ones who are suffering, then we can't just enjoy life and thank God for our blessings while remaining disconnected from those who do suffer. Because if we remain unrelated to the brokenness of this world, if we allow the gaps between us and those who suffer to persist, then we might just find ourselves on the wrong side of the gap when God makes all things right. We don't have to make all things right. God will take care of that. But we do have to be in relationship with those who suffer. We have to be aware of them, pray for them, reach out to them, allow their suffering to make a difference in our lives. That's what Moses and the prophets have taught us from the beginning. That's why Jesus came among us, to love us, to heal us, and to bring new life to us, so that we could be one with God and one with each other in this life and in the next. Gaps are hard to live with. They leave us empty and give us a sinking feeling in our stomachs. They call us to try to bridge them. We do not need to save the world. Jesus Christ has already done that. We need simply to see ourselves related to those around us, especially to those who struggle and suffer in this world. For if we allow our lives to be changed by their challenges in life, then we can be sure to be on the right side of God when He changes all things in the next. Amen.